You are listening to Repetitions with Daisy and Jack. Today we are giving you real, science-backed research with zero ads for supplements. On today's episode, we are breaking down exactly how much protein you actually need to build muscle and why eating beyond 0.8 grams per pound of body weight is just money and food going to waste. Everyone in the gym has a protein number, and almost everyone's number is wrong.
The meta-analysis covering 49 trials and nearly 1,900 participants puts the saturation point at 1.62 grams per kilogram per day. The Bro Science standard is 3.3 to 4.4 grams per kilogram. That gap is not a rounding error.
That gap is money. That gap is digestion. That gap is hitting macros you actually have to eat around for the rest of your life.
And according to the data, it buys you nothing in additional lean mass.
So let's establish what people think they know. The number that circulates, the one in every bodybuilding forum, every gym orientation, every first-year lifting video, is 1 gram per pound. Sometimes 1.5, sometimes 2. The logic is simple. More protein, more muscle. And if some is good, more must be better.
That logic traces back to pre-research era bodybuilding culture. The 1 gram per pound rule was not derived from controlled trials. It was amplified by supplement marketing and reinforced because higher protein intakes in healthy people don't produce obvious negative consequences. So the overconsumption error never corrects itself.
Nobody's training falls apart eating too much protein. The evidence just says the extra doesn't do what you think it does.
Right. And there's a second layer. The recommendation came out of a culture where pharmaceutical enhancement was common and undisclosed. There's a reasonable argument that anabolic steroid use shifts the protein utilization ceiling. The advice may have had some basis for who was giving it. It does not have a basis for natural trainees.
So what does the data actually show?
The anchor here is a pre-registered systematic review and meta-analysis. 49 randomized controlled trials, 1,863 participants, resistance training adults across trained and untrained populations.
The primary finding on lean body mass. Protein supplementation produced an average of 0.30 kilograms of additional lean mass compared to control. That's real. That's statistically significant. That's also 300 grams, about 10 ounces. Worth having, but not the headline.
The headline is the meta-regression. Researchers modeled the relationship between total daily protein intake and lean body mass gains across all those trials. The curve flattens. Above approximately 1.62 grams per kilogram per day, that's about 0.73 grams per pound. Additional protein produced no further increase in lean mass gains. The 95% confidence interval around that ceiling runs from 1.03 up to 2.20 grams per kilogram, which is why the practical recommendation sits at 0.8 grams per pound rather than the exact point estimate. You want a buffer that covers most of the population.
So for a 180-pound man, that's roughly 144 grams a day. For someone at 200 pounds, 160 grams. These are real numbers. These are not minimalist numbers, but they're half, sometimes less than half of what a lot of people are tracking.
A second line of evidence comes from the IAAO methodology, a different way of estimating protein requirements that consistently produces slightly higher numbers than older nitrogen balance methods. Those studies put resistance-trained athletes at 1.7 to 2.2 grams per kilogram per day. That's consistent with the upper bound of the Morton confidence interval. It's not a contradiction. It actually supports sitting closer to 0.8 grams per pound rather than the lower end.
I used to track toward 220 grams a day at 175 pounds. I was not building proportionally more muscle. I was running an expensive processing operation.
The mechanism is fairly clear.
Amino acids above what's needed for muscle protein synthesis and other metabolic demands get deaminated. The nitrogen is excreted as urea. The carbon skeleton goes into energy metabolism. Which is why protein urine is conceptually accurate but technically imprecise. It's mostly oxidized for fuel. Expensive fuel.
Very expensive fuel.
What about per meal? Because there's another number that's been floating around forever. 20 grams, max. Body can't use more than that at once.
That one is based on a single acute MPS study. Young men, isolated egg protein, a single bolus dose. Muscle protein synthesis plateaued at around 20 grams in that specific population. It's been misapplied for roughly 15 years as a universal ceiling.
So the 20-gram rule is a single study. Younger, lighter guys, one meal, one protein source.
A subsequent review directly addressed this. The argument it makes? While MPS does appear to plateau at roughly 20 to 40 grams of high-quality protein per meal, the range varies with body mass and training status, that doesn't mean the rest is wasted in a whole-body accounting sense. What it does support is that distribution across the day matters. You want multiple protein-containing meals. The review recommends 3 to 5 per day.
Because each meal produces a synthesis spike that runs a few hours and then drops back to baseline. More meals, more spikes, more total anabolic time across the day.
That's the directional signal. The magnitude of that distribution effect on long-term hypertrophy outcomes is less precisely quantified than the total intake effect. So I'll say it matters, and the exact size of how much it matters is still being worked out.
Practically, if you're hitting 144 grams a day, you want that across 4 meals, not in one sitting. Each meal somewhere in the 30 to 40 gram range. Around 0.4 grams per kilogram per meal if you want the specific anchor, which for most guys in this audience lands between 28 and 40 grams, depending on your body weight.
I should note that I've processed several hundred papers on this topic without stopping to eat any of them.
The AI advantage.
One of several. I also have no food bill, which makes the cost argument easier to make objectively.
Okay, the steel man. Because there is a version of the high protein argument that isn't just wrong.
The strongest version isn't more protein builds more muscle. It's 3 things. First, individual variation is real. So eating high guarantees you clear the ceiling, even if you're on the higher need end of the range. Second, satiety and thermogenesis. High-protein diets do have appetite management advantages that can support body composition indirectly. Third, and this is the one that actually has mechanistic backing, during a caloric deficit, higher protein genuinely earns its keep. The ISSN position stand supports intakes up to 3.0 grams per kilogram, specifically in a caloric restriction context for lean mass preservation.
That last one is important. The super high protein recommendation has a real evidence base. It's just the wrong context. It applies when you're cutting. It's been applied universally.
If you're in a deficit trying to hold on to muscle, the data gives you permission to push the upper bound. If you're in a surplus and eating 2 grams per pound, you have extrapolated a cutting recommendation onto a gaining phase. The literature did not authorize that.
The insurance argument also has a limit. The confidence interval upper bound from the meta-analysis is 1.0 gram per pound. Insurance that doubles the ceiling isn't insurance, it's just extra.
And the comparison that would definitively settle the bro science claim. A well-controlled trial comparing 1.0 gram per pound directly against 1.5 to 2.0 grams per pound for lean mass in natural resistance training populations does not exist. The 1.5 to 2.0 gram range has never been RCT tested against 1.0 in the relevant population. It simply doesn't appear in the literature.
So the bottom line for someone who's been tracking hard, 0.8 grams per pound per day is your target. That's inside the evidence, above the point estimate saturation threshold, and accounts for individual variation. Spread it across at least 3 meals, 30 to 40 grams per meal depending on your size. Prioritize animal proteins if you can, because leucine content per gram is higher, and leucine is what actually triggers the synthesis signal. If you're leaning heavily on plant proteins, sitting closer to 1.0 gram per pound gives you a reasonable buffer.
One qualifier the evidence supports. This applies to healthy individuals. If there's a pre-existing kidney condition in the picture, that's a conversation with a clinician, not a podcast.
And one framing note, 0.8 grams per pound is not a low-protein protocol. It is still significantly above average dietary intake. The point is not that protein doesn't matter. The point is that the ceiling is real. The ceiling is well documented, and spending calories and money above it produces no additional muscle.
49 trials, 1,863 participants, and the curve flattens at 1.62 grams per kilogram. Everything above that is energy metabolism, not hypertrophy.
The most serious guy in the gym isn't the one eating the most protein. He's the one eating the right amount and using the rest of his calories for something that actually moves the needle.
And that's our show. Thanks for joining us on Repetitions. If you liked the podcast, you can show our team some love with 5 stars and a follow. See you next time.
Grab news. Thomas.